thank you everybody for joining us for this week's PAVE virtual panel, where we're going to discuss the topic of first responders and AVs. My name is Tabitha Coulter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and your moderator for today's panel. I'm excited to introduce you today to our two panelists, both of whom are members of our PAVE Public Sector Advisory Council, and we're really lucky to have involved. First off, we have Saul Jaeger, Commander of the Field Operations Division for the Mountain View Police Department in California. Saul, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning. Morning. It's morning for me.
And second, we have Mark Kopko, Director of the Office of Transformational Technology with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, or PennDOT as it's known more commonly. Mark, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we brought Saul and Mark on today to share their unique experiences and knowledge with us on the relationship between autonomous vehicles and first responders. This is a dynamic and fascinating subject that we could talk about for much longer than 30 minutes. But we're really hoping today's discussion will spark some interest in the topic, both for those of you in the audience who may be new to this topic, and also for those of you joining us from other DOTs or police departments that may be in different phases of planning for this technology yourself. So speaking of planning, I wanted to kick this conversation off with a really broad question of both of you to understand how you began this journey. Take us back to the first time you realized autonomous vehicles might be coming to your area. How did you start to prepare for a challenge that doesn't have a playbook to follow? Saul, could you start by maybe giving us a look at the most immediate, the most pressing concerns to your police department when this topic first came up?
Sure. Yeah, we started the conversation with autonomous vehicle companies with Google prior to them even being Waymo. Almost actually a little more than 10 years ago now. And it's coming, whether you like it or not, it's coming to your area. For us, initially, there was a lot of fear, more fear of the unknown, and a lot of concern about safety. And I think that was very reflective of our community as well. Anything that's a new technology, that's something that's autonomous, that doesn't have people behind it, there's a fear response to that in general. And so I think the police department mirrored our community, and we were also concerned about how these things were going to work, and all the questions, the natural questions that would come up, right? How is it going to stop? How does it know? What is the technology? And there was a lot of fear around that. And then the other big ticket in this was safety. What are the safety protocols with a vehicle that's operating on its own? With all of this unknown happening, and that's where the safety drivers came in. And I think we're in the law enforcement world. We're generally pretty good about preparing for challenges that we have no idea what's coming. COVID is a good response to that. Civil unrest is a good response to good example of these kind of things. And so this was just another one of those. How do we incorporate this new technology into maybe systems that we already have? That are in place, or pivot and do things differently to adjust to how it's going. And I'll give more details as we go along into some of the things that we did as well.
Great, thank you. Mark, is there anything that you can add about the approach you took at PennDOT? I know you guys are at a slightly different phase in the development and in the plan, so anything you have to add there?
Yeah, sure. So it started for us back in 2011. Back then, Carnegie Mellon University approached PennDOT and a couple of our public sector organizations with interest to start beginning on-road testing. So that immediately caused some initial concerns that people started addressing. Of course, safety is always paramount, but then all outside of that was the legality question. It basically led to our first initial interpretation of our vehicle code, which basically our stance is, as long as there's a licensed driver willing and able to take over control sitting behind the steering wheel, it doesn't matter if the automated system is actually then doing the actual operations of the vehicle. So once we started figuring that out, then it started to move on to the safety side. So there was coordination. With our local police, our state police, the DOT, which also has the DMV underneath it. So that's all contained within the organization. And then of course the locals. So the city of Pittsburgh was a critical component there, making sure all the partners were having discussions, understanding what was the actual intent, understanding the safety protocols and safety measures put in place with the safety drivers. And then there are things like how was the testing verified prior to actually doing anything on the roadway, and any type of other protocols they might have in place. So once we started having that discussion and people became more familiarized with what was going to happen, it just made it a little bit easier for a rollout.
Absolutely. Saul, I wanted to get back to you. So, as you mentioned, Mountain View is the home of Google and the autonomous company Waymo, which, like you said, Mountain View has been involved with this for, 10 years, the testing and deployment. So I'm curious how your department has worked to kind of encourage those relationships between law enforcement or other first responders and the AV developers in your jurisdiction. How have you learned to make that relationship the most constructive and the best it can be?
Yeah, so we started very early with Google. One of the things that we were very insistent upon was having a person to connect with at whatever company it was, and that you can fast forward to today, where I can be quite honest with you, I've lost count of the number of AV type companies that are testing and operating in the city of Mountain View itself, and that's everything from the little robot delivery things that drive down the sidewalks to big rig testing and things like commercial testing that are happening here as well. And so, but one of the things that the biggest lessons that we learned very early was we wanted to have somebody that we could call, a human being 24/7 that we could reach, that was also a decision maker. And the reason for that was you can imagine the potential PR issues around something that would happen, like say a collision that happens. Who handles the information that's going out? What can be put out? Is like, for instance, the AV company going to be the primary source of information going out to the public in regards to a crash? What is law enforcement's responsibility in those types of circumstances? So it happened with Waymo as sort of our pilot program for us. We were meeting with them almost every week, just talking about trying to understand the product, how it worked, because this was all new to us as well. Talking to them about their safety protocols, how they work, reporting, how they're working with our DMV and our regulations side of the world. And as we became more comfortable, those meetings got pushed to a month, every month, and then every 3 months, and then twice a year. And now I don't remember the last time we've had a meeting with them, because I can pick up the phone and literally call somebody to talk to. But we've used that same model for every company that's testing in Mountain View. It's been very, very good. But that insistence on a person to talk to that's a decision maker 24/7 made a big difference for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Mark, again, pivoting to you in a slightly different perspective, I know that PennDOT's recently updated AV testing guidance requires all AV testers to provide an emergency service responders plan. I'm assuming this is something that a lot of other states and local agencies might be interested in incorporating into their own AV planning. So could you walk us through that plan, what the requirements are, how that works?
Sure, yeah. Strongly encourage other people to look at taking a similar approach. There's definitely members of industry, Waymo and others that have already gone out and produced plans and making it publicly available. It's great for first responders. It was important to us here in Pennsylvania, just because as testing has progressed, we now have testing occurring or is expected to be occurring, according to the testers, what they've reported, in 56 of our 67 counties, and 42% of our counties will have 2 or more testers. So that's not just necessarily localized to, say Pittsburgh or to another metropolitan area. It's spread around the state, which means there's a variety of different first responders, law enforcement, EMS, fire, towers are very much critical to these operations as well. So it was important to us to make sure that we had everything documented, so that as testing progresses, we can then share that with the appropriate first responders and make sure they have everything. So we require within our testing guidance for testers to provide an emergency service responders plan. And it's to provide all the necessary information that a responder may need to safely address an incident involving their AV. So at a minimum, that should include how to identify the vehicle, including branding, things like that, how to secure the vehicle. So looking at how to disengage the ADS, how to make sure that, what type of visual cues or other type of notifications that the ADS is actually disengaged, location of the registration, proof of insurance, just because some of these vehicles, it might not be in the standard list you might consider. Then other things like extrication considerations, towing considerations. This was a big one for us. Talking to our towers and our wreckers, they had concerns. Of course, law enforcement, of course, fire and EMS did. The towers and wreckers had a big concern, especially as it went to, I don't want to put this onto a flatbed and hook up a winch somewhere wrong, and now I just damaged the sensor that was not damaged before, and that sensor's worth tens of thousands of dollars. Am I going to be held liable? So I'm going to get those towing considerations, firefighting considerations, post-crash considerations, especially as it goes to data retention, any other type of considerations that you may have. So we're trying to get that all documented up front so that we can then start sharing that and start training with our first responders and make sure that there's a unified understanding of what needs to be done if one of these vehicles are ever in an incident.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And I do want to kind of dig a little deeper into some of those things you mentioned about that AVs should be capable of to interact responsibly with first responders. But before that, I wanted to ask a question that we do hear a lot, which is, what happens if an autonomous vehicle breaks the law? We know they're usually explicitly programmed to not do that, but just hypothetically, how would that situation work? Saul, I don't know if you might be best to start.
I guess that's in my book. Well, we don't have handcuffs big enough to put on a autonomous vehicle, not yet. No, in reality, the vehicles are programmed, and this is something we've learned over time as well, right? Like there were some things that we were concerned about when we talk about safety that are not simply physical safety issues, but like, can somebody take control of that vehicle and use it as a weapon, right? Mm-hmm. So we have bad actors and terrorism kind of issues around that. And then there's a whole bunch of other crimes that are connected with this industry as well whenever you have a point of sale issue, right? So there's identity theft, there's a bunch of other things that can happen around this. And we'll get into maybe some of these other things as well. There's crimes that can happen in the vehicle as well, right? So the vehicle can be used as an accessory in a crime. It can be the crime itself, and or crimes or emergencies can happen in the cabin of the vehicle itself. And so as we grew and grow continually with the industry, the companies that have really opened their doors to allow, even there's one company that's even drew on a panel of law enforcement people from our area, and it was a very interesting kind of design thinking session where they had their engineers on the outside and all the cops sitting around a table on the inside, and the engineers were only allowed to listen. And they had questions posed to us about these kind of things, right? Yeah. And it was, from our world, which is dark, gloomy, and scary, and that kind of thing, we brought up some issues around this kind of thing, like highway robbery, right? If the car is not supposed to run you over, well, if I'm a criminal and I know that, I'm just going to stand in front of the car, and then it'll stop, and then everybody inside is going to be a victim of a robbery at that point, right? So, these kind of things, how does the car lock itself? Can it be remotely locked? Can it be remotely unlocked? What about facial recognition and all these other kind of things? So I think at the end of the day, the fear of an autonomous army of cars becoming sentient and taking over the world and causing crime and stuff is we're not quite there yet. But I think that we've had several collisions involving autonomous vehicles throughout our town. And interestingly enough, most of them have been caused by the other person. So the autonomous vehicle has been the one that was struck, not doing anything wrong. And it's usually human inattention, right? Or assuming that a person would normally go in this situation, but the car decided not to because it was a bit unsafe, and it's programmed to be more safe. And just last on that real quick, technology is always going to outrun legislation no matter what, right? It's always going to be, the legislation side is always going to be behind the technology, and that's not just in the AV industry. And so it's really good when local DMVs or Department of Transportations are aware and are working on these things as new technology keeps coming at them. It's really critical that things like the different documents that are out there, the legislative bodies being involved in these kind of things, and asking those questions.
That's really helpful. Mark, do you have anything to add there, or maybe about how we can help ensure that AVs are yielding to ambulances or fire trucks or any other first responder vehicles?
Yeah, I think that if the goal was to make sure that the vehicles are interacting properly with first responders is have that conversation. And Saul touched on a lot of this, being able to have that open conversation, call up someone, get things up front. You can get safety cases built around how do you interact with first responders, put the onus on the actual tester. We do have that in our testing guidance. If somebody, especially if they're moving from 2 safety operators down to 1, there's a variety of additional things you have to do, including providing a safety case on how you interact around first responders. So it's not only just recognizing, but it's also then navigating around, what are you going to do when there's an officer on the street directing traffic by hand, in inclement weather at nighttime, those types of situations, that are putting a first responder in an environment that could be potentially, harmful for them under any driving condition, let alone then trying to make sure, an automated driving system that might be more on the, R&D side where it's still being developed is properly functioning. And that's also then ties back to the safety operators that you have within the vehicles. That's your first and last line of defense there on top of the ADS system, to make sure that they understand and they understand not only what you're looking for from an operation standpoint, but also from what is necessary for a first responder and what they're expecting it to do. And Saul touched on a lot of that. And I think that's critical. Open communications, especially in the early stages of this technology, as we're starting to roll things out, is critical. It's important for the ADS developers and engineers to understand what we're thinking on the other side of the table, and vice versa. So open dialogue is critical.
Yeah. On that topic of kind of the safety drivers and like their role there, I'm curious, if we can talk a little bit more about what difference that those safety drivers make, and also how a fully driverless deployment might sort of differ when we're thinking about these kind of topics. Saul, do you have anything?
Sure. I'm not sure how we're ping-ponging this back and forth. Yeah, the safety drivers are really critical. I see one of the questions in the chat about the possibility of true level 4 or even higher. There are companies that are doing some delivery with fully autonomous already modes in Mountain View, and some are following them with a chase car. Others are not. And so we're getting there. I mean, Mountain View, I could see this happening on the horizon very soon. And a lot of these companies actually pivoted during COVID to provide delivery of touchless delivery of goods and things rather than delivering people, which was kind of an interesting quick pivot for these companies as well. But it was more proof of concept and viability of that. But the drivers, when trained correctly, are really invaluable, because one of the, and I'm a disclaimer, not an engineer at all, but trying to engineer the amount of decisions that are being made in the human mind as things are going, as well as experience. If you've driven in a city for any length of time, you have intuition and some experience of what the car in front of you is probably going to do, based on a lot of experience that you've had as a driver, or even as a passenger if you're paying attention. And so having the safety drivers there is really important. I do envision a time, probably soon, that they're going to start not being in the vehicles.
And that's when that communication that you've talked about before, having those channels set up, becomes so important. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mark, I was curious, I wanted to kind of get into training and testing and how we, go through those conversations with first responders. And we had a question in the chat actually asking if either of you have done incident training with an actual vehicle. And Mark, I was curious if you could talk to the experiences you've had at PennDOT with that.
Sure. So we're starting to move towards the training phase right now. We're in the process of wrapping up a statewide incident response plan. So to make sure first responders have what they need necessary in case there is an AV incident. And the next phase of that is training. That ties all into our emergency response plans that they have to submit, and that IRP that we are actually creating along with that. We have done demonstrations. We've worked with industry partners to demonstrate the benefit in a closed course environment. We've done demonstrations in partnership with Volvo and Penn State up in the State College region, where they've demonstrated how a vehicle could potentially alert first responders, especially looking through things like connectivity. But we've not done any necessarily hands-on training with the vehicles that are on the roadways right now in Pittsburgh. But we're planning to move towards that phase now that we have information, and once we start to try and get all of our first responders up to speed with what they need to know, based off what we've provided by the testers, they actually then hopefully open up a forum here where we can start having those testers then interact directly with first responders where applicable.
That's great. Saul, anything to add there about the experiences you all have had in Mountain View?
Yeah, similar. Just to build on that a little bit, Mark mentioned earlier the law enforcement interaction plans. That's actually a requirement for the autonomous vehicle certificate to operate in California. And so those are publicly available documents. And some of those companies have also provided videos and other things that we've reviewed and played for our officers over and over again, kind of washing this information over them during our daily briefing trainings that we have. Additionally, many of the larger companies, we've actually offered to help them with testing. So they've used our emergency vehicles from different directions, so they can hear the sirens, they can see the lights, the computers can learn what they sound like, what they look like coming from different angles, and including our fire apparatus as well. That's been really cool. And many of us have driven in these vehicles as well, which is at first a little terrifying if anybody's done it, but once you realize what's happening and what it's doing, it also builds confidence on our end.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you, guys. Another kind of pivoting question. So wondering about AVs as a potential resource for law enforcement or DOTs, especially given the huge amounts of data that they're constantly recording. What does that aspect of this relationship look like, and what sort of considerations or policies kind of need to be in place regarding any of that data sharing? Mark, do you want to go first?
Sure. We think that with the variety of sensors and the storage of data offers a potential opportunity here for law enforcement and other first responders that we don't have right now. And you're necessarily using current data recorders within vehicles. So with that, the big consider we have right now is one, data retention, and then number two is access to that data. Because especially as these vehicles are being developed and they're not necessarily in a full production or deployment type of scenario, a lot of this data is being stored in a proprietary format that you need the assistance actually of that specific developer to get to. So that's a critical component, especially in early stages, to make sure you understand, okay, what does a first responder need to know in the case of an incident? One, to make sure the data is preserved. And then two, going back to having that relationship, having that rapport, to make sure that you can have access to that data. We do require through our testing guidance that testers commit to sharing that data with first responders and the department in the event of an incident occurring. And we do that on purpose just because we know that we need that assistance. And we've seen this with other things. We've seen this with NTSB working with Uber in Arizona after the Tempe incident. You need to have that coordination to make sure, because it's new. It's new to first responders, it's new to DOTs. We're not necessarily used to data in this type of format. So how do you process it? How do you understand it?
Yeah. Saul, anything to add?
I do. So as a traffic reconstruction geek myself, when we first started talking about this and I was realizing what information is actually available, even if the vehicle is not necessarily involved directly in an incident, say for instance, it's waiting at a red light and a collision happens in front of it, my investigative ears perked up and went, wait a minute, we can have all that data, so we'll know then who ran the red light, right? It's pretty clear. And so with that said, it's kind of like any other electronic evidence. We as law enforcement will follow legal process, so search warrants, whatever, preservation letters and things to hold the data that we're potentially going to need. There have been already some cases solved in regards to shootings, drive-by shootings and things like that. When an AV was in the area, we were able to, not necessarily Mountain View, but law enforcement was able to collect enough information to build leads to further a case based on the information. And so that's one piece of the pie there. You kind of go wild as an investigator thinking about all of the information that's available there. Even information about physics changes, so a delta of speeds and things like that when you're talking about a collision incident. Secondarily, we learned very early, which has been a huge help for us, is that almost kind of an unintended positive consequence from this for law enforcement was roadway condition monitoring. And not just roadway conditioning in like, oh, it's raining, so the roadways are wet, but more around lane markings are wrong. And the way this came up to us was in these communication meetings that we were having very often, they would say, hey, our car was confused about this intersection. what is it supposed to do? Like the law says this, but the markings say this, right? And so we would go back and say, oh, I mean, let me go look at it or do a field visit. And, 9 times out of 10, we're like, wow, yeah, that's not painted correctly, right? And that's a potential liability for the city that leads to a bunch of other things that ended up having us improve the roadway conditions and things, even things like covered signs, curb markings, things like that will get seen eventually. They're seen every day by these vehicles, right? So it just helps us with information. That was a good example of sort of an unintended positive consequence for this.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I really appreciate you both talking to that. I'm curious, as we're kind of drawing near the end of our time, if there's what kind of final advice, if you had one big piece of advice you would give to first responder departments or DOTs who are preparing for their jurisdiction's first AV deployment or going through this process for the first time, what would you really want to leave them with, lessons learned from you? Mark?
Sure, I think open communications is critical. It's important to get all the right stakeholders at the table and have that conversation up front. Once you understand the concerns of all the parties, it makes things a lot easier. It makes things easier pulling together documentations. It makes things easier just doing any type of evaluation as things are going on to make sure everything is where it needs to be and actually operating according to what you previously discussed. It's just critical to identify all the stakeholders right at the start as best as you can and bring them together, but at the same time, have that flexibility, understanding that something's going to come up. You're going to not account for something, and you need to have that flexibility to bring in another group or pivot to another conversation or to start looking at things from a different angle. So that would be my recommendation.
And if organizations wanted to see the work that PennDOT has been doing in these, can they find those on your website, or how could they find that info?
Yeah, we put our information that we're doing once it's publicly available on PennDOT.gov/AV.
Great, thank you. Saul, what about you? What would kind of your main piece of advice be to groups going through this for the first time?
Call Mark, because that was awesome. No, he's right. I think the first thing for law enforcement really is to understand that it's coming. It's coming to your town. You go back and look at if you can think about when cars were being first imagined, right? And people were riding horses. And if you went to somebody and said, hey, I have this great idea, there's going to be these vehicles that can go like 15, 20, 30 times faster than the horse that you're on. You're in control, and everybody will agree that a green light means that you go, and everybody will stop. Don't worry, everybody will listen. It'll be great. You would think that person was insane, right? Today, horses are now ridden in a pasture somewhere else. And so this is coming. So first of all, just understand that piece. Second of all, be curious and ask, right? Reach out, talk to the people that are involved in these things, have that open line of communication. And if you don't know something, ask, right? And be very, very curious about this. Your input as law enforcement and your experience is really valuable to these companies as well. And so that it's a two-way thing. So just ask and be curious. And then, like Mark said, again, communicate. You have to communicate. You should never be done. When you're done communicating, you need to communicate more.
Great. Well, that gets us really close to our wrap-up time. So I just want to say thank you again, Saul and Mark, for lending us your time, lending us these experience and this information that you have. We really hope it's beneficial to other groups, other jurisdictions considering this. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us for another weekly PAVE panel. We'll be doing one next week on safe public road testing, and we hope to have you join us then. And as a reminder too, all of these videos get archived. We keep them on our YouTube channel where you can access them at any time. You can look at our PAVE website, pavecampaign.org, and find those all there. Thank you again, Mark and Saul.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.